Hello, I'm Patrick Holberg, and today I want to talk about the one-factor international trade model, sometimes referred to as the Ricardian Model. All right, so today we're going to assume that we live in a perfect world. A perfect world is defined as one where all markets are perfectly competitive. There are no other market failures, so there's no externalities and public goods, and all countries are small. All right, so in this case, we're going to assume there are two countries, country A and country B. There's only one factor, so let's assume that factor is labor, and all workers are identical. And then they can produce two goods, good X and good Y. Let's assume that the two countries have resources that are given by LA and LB. And actually, to keep it tractable, I'm just going to assume that the labor endowment in the two countries is exactly the same. So LA equals LB. The technology is given to us by these 4 unit labor requirements. A unit labor requirement tells us how many units of labor it takes to produce 1 unit of a good. So ALXA says that it will take this many units of L to produce 1 unit of good X in country A. Let's assume that ALXA is less than ALXB. That is, the unit labor requirement to produce good X in country A is less than the unit labor requirement to produce good X in country B. That means that country A has an absolute advantage in producing good X. A small or low unit labor requirement means it takes few units of labor to produce a good, which is, of course, the country that has a lower one will have or be more productive. Assume also that the ALY for the B country is less than ALY for the A country, so that B country has an absolute advantage in the production of good Y. We can manipulate these unit labor requirements slightly, so we can have that the ratio of the unit labor requirements in country A, where you put X on top and Y at the bottom, is less than the same ratio in country B. Since this ratio of ALX to ALY gives us the opportunity cost of good X in terms of good Y, that is, how many units of good Y do you have to give up to produce 1 unit of good X in country A? And this is how many units of good Y do you have to give up to produce 1 unit of good X in country B. And since the opportunity cost of X is lower in the A country, based on our assumptions here, we can conclude that country A has a comparative advantage in the production of good X. And similarly, country B will have a comparative advantage in the production of good Y. Just knowing this and understanding comparative advantage, we know that country A should be specializing, hopefully, if they can, but certainly trading and exporting good X in return for good Y from country B. Okay, so we know what our resources are, what our technology are across the two countries. And if we know resources and technology, we can draw a PPF, the combination of all goods that can be produced given resources and technology. Now, if all the workers in country A went into the Y industry, then we could produce this many Y goods. And if all the workers in A went to the the X industry, we could produce this many units of X. Since technology never changes, we know we're going to have a straight line PPF, and there it is. This is the PPF for country A. For country B, because we know they have the same amount of workers, so LA equals LB, but their absolute advantage is different, we would expect them to be able to produce a greater amount of Y, because they have an absolute advantage in the production of Y, but they're not as good at producing good X So they won't be able to produce quite as many of good units of good X, which is why we would expect this PPF to be a straight line, but it's going to have a steeper slope. Now you remember that the slope of the PPF is equal to the opportunity cost of the good on the x-axis, in this case, good X. So what we have here is, of course, that the slope is the ratio of these two unit labor requirements, which is equal to the opportunity cost of good X. And we have it over here, same thing. Sorry. But because the unit labor requirements are different in two countries, we know that the country has a comparative advantage in the production of good X, and therefore we know, again, that the opportunity cost in country A is lower than it is in country B. Now, when you start trading with each other, there will be some kind of international relative price. We call that the terms of trade. And the rule is that the terms of trade has to be in between the two countries' opportunity costs. We know that to be true because if it was on the outside of the opportunity cost, then one country would not want to trade. For example, if the terms of trade, the relative price of good X, was lower than the opportunity cost in country A, then what that would mean is that country A would give up more units of Y to produce a good X than they can get when selling that good X to country B. Obviously, they don't want to do that. So we know that our relative price, our terms of trade, is going to have to be in between the two countries' opportunity costs. Okay, so once we know what the terms of trade is, we can start exploring which country will be exporting which good and so forth. We already know the answer, of course. Country A is going to be exporting good X. Country B is going to be exporting good Y because of the comparative advantage. But let's just focus on country A right now. Suppose country A has preferences that has let them decide, or the country, consumers and producers, have decided that they want to produce this many X and this many Y. And of course, if they don't trade, that is exactly the combination of X and Y that they will be consuming. So what that means is that there must have been some kind of indifference curve here that is tangent to that point, and they have allocated LYA number of workers to the Y industry and LXA workers to the X industry. So this is where they are producing right now. Now, the question we are faced with is, if this country, country A, decides to trade with country B, will it be better off? And secondly, will the workers, LXA, LYA, will they be better off if they trade with country B? Well, that's a question. Usually we would go very quickly here, draw a terms of trade line to show that this is actually good for the entire country. But in this video, I just want to go a little bit more carefully, and I want to look at the real wages of all the workers at different times and different situations. All right, so I'm going to think about the real wages, the purchasing power of a worker in country A. Well, it turns out that the purchasing power and the real wage could actually be different between the workers in industry Y and the workers in industry X. But they could also be the same, so it depends on our assumption. So let me just start. Let's look at industry X right now. So we're thinking of workers that are in industry X. Clearly, the real wage in terms of good X, that is, how many units of good X could they produce and therefore consume. So W divided by PX is equal to, because the markets are perfectly competitive, is equal to the marginal product of the worker. The unit labor requirements translate into marginal product if you take the inverse. So 1 divided by ALXA, this is going to be the number of good X that a worker will be producing and therefore may be consuming of good X if she works in industry X. Now, suppose this worker actually wants to consume some Y goods. That makes sense. Preferences are such that everybody wants to consume a little bit of both goods. Well, the real wage, or the purchasing power in terms of good Y, is determined by how many good X do they produce, and then what is the price that they can trade good X for good Y within their own country. So we know that they produce ALX. This is the number of units of good X they will be producing. But if they want to trade that good for good Y, they will be trading it at the opportunity cost within country A. So the opportunity cost of X is ALX divided by ALY, which then, by simplification here, they can consume A divided by ALY units of good Y. All right, so this is the purchasing power in the two goods for a worker that works in industry X. If you work in industry Y, then your real wage in terms of good X, well, first of all, perfectly competitive markets tells us that they're going to be producing 1 divided by ALY units of good Y. Then they want to trade that for good X if they want to consume some of good X. And they're going to have to use the opportunity cost of good Y to do that. Which gives us actually the same amount of good X as the X worker could be consuming. And the purchasing power in terms of good Y, in this case, they don't have to trade because this is the good that they're actually producing. So they can get ALY units of good Y. All right, so this tells us the real wage of an X worker and the real wage of a Y worker, the purchasing power before trade. The question is, will these workers be better off if they're allowed to trade with country B? Well, let's check. The key thing here, and this is the key thing for how we solve these problems, is that the workers will be facing a different relative price. All right, so that we know that when you open up a trade, the terms of trade, the relative price, will be in between the two countries' opportunity cost. And in particular here, we see that when you look at the opportunity cost of good X, the real price of X, the terms of trade in terms of good X, will be higher. All right, so if we translate our real wages into what will they be after trade, then we can see, first of all, and this is going to be pretty intuitive to you, that a worker in industry X who only consumes good X would, of course, have the same amount of goods, the same purchasing power in terms of good X as they did before. Because nothing happens to technology, so the worker's ability to produce good X stays exactly the same. But the important point is when you think about good Y for a worker in the X industry. So now when we look at the real wage in terms of good Y for this worker, we know again that they will be producing ALX, 1 divided by ALX units of good X. But now they can trade that good at a different price at the terms of trade. But because the terms of trade is greater than opportunity cost of good X, we know that they actually, this will be greater than ALY, units of good Y. So what we have shown here is that with trade, a worker in industry X can consume the same amount of good X, but they can consume more of good Y. This is, of course, the reason why a worker in the X industry has an incentive to sell her good to country B consumers, instead of country A consumers. Because in country A, you're just going to get the opportunity cost, but in country B, they get a higher relative price for that good. All right, what about a worker in industry Y? First of all, if the worker were to consume only good Y, then they'd be exactly the same because the technology stays the same, and therefore there's no difference in the number of Y goods that they can actually produce and consume. However, if the worker in good industry Y wants to consume some good X, they're going to have to trade for it. And therefore, the relative price, a relative wage in terms of good X will be different. So they produce ALY, but now they're trading these Y for good X at a new price. It's no longer the opportunity cost, it's going to be the terms of trade. And the terms of trade was higher in terms of good X, but the inverse means that this is actually lower. And since they're trading at a less favorable price, that product is actually less than what they got when they could trade their Y goods for X goods at the opportunity cost, the more favorable opportunity cost. So what we see here is that when we have trade, before anybody has moved in any way, we have that workers in the X industry, which is the export industry, are better off because their purchasing power has increased, while workers in the Y industry, which is the import competing industry, are actually worse off. What we see here is that we have both winners and losers. All right, before I explore that a little bit more carefully, let's go back to the entire country. If you look at the country, and again, I'm assuming what's called perfect factor immobility, that is, no worker has moved yet. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the short run. The short run is defined as there is at least one factor that is fixed. And of course, we only have one factor. So our labor is fixed. So wherever the labor is located before trade, they're going to be located in the same industry after trade. So there is perfect factor immobility between industries. However, the workers can still trade at the more favorable terms of trade. So even though we cannot move our production point, which is still right there, we can trade at a terms of trade that is steeper than the opportunity cost. So our terms of trade will look something like this, which will allow us to reach an indifference curve or a consumption point that is outside of our original PPF. So the entire country is definitely better off. We can consume more of at least something. And if we have preferences that are nice, so our indifference curves look like this, then we can see we can reach a higher indifference curve. All right, so what we have, just to conclude, before anybody is allowed to move, so while we're still in the short run, we see that the country is better off because we can be outside of our PPF, but there will be both winners. They will be in the export industry, and losers. They will be in the import competing industry, and that's it. Of course, if we allow time to pass, then what we will see is that factors will no longer be fixed. They're going to be variable. And in the long run, all factors are variable. So we have perfect factor mobility. So workers can move anywhere they want. And of course, you can see where they want to work. All the workers would like to work in the export industry because their real wage is higher than it was without trade. So what we would expect to happen is that some, or maybe all, of the Y industry workers will start migrating, moving up into the X industry. And of course, that's exactly what we have to have in order to have specialization. That is, in order to specialize in our comparative advantage good, we need to move from here down to here if we have complete specialization. But that move, of course, requires Y workers to become X workers. So as Y workers move to the X industry, we are specializing, so we're moving down our PPF here. And then when we get to complete specialization, we can still trade at the terms of trade. And these two curves, these terms of trade lines should be more or less parallel to each other. But what we can see is that you can reach a point that is even farther outside of your PPF, or you can reach an even higher indifference curve. So the country as a whole is definitely even better off compared to both before trade and after trade in the short run. All right, so the country is better off. And if we go to the workers, we can see well, we had that industry-wide workers were worse off, but now they are just going to start moving up to or move into the X industry, which means that now they too will have a higher real wage. They have a greater purchasing power across the two goods. If they want to consume both X and Y goods, they will now have more of it than they did before trade. And what this means is that all workers will be better off. So let me just conclude, because this is the story that we have told right now. What we have seen is that countries are better off from trade. So the entire country, the trading nation, is better off from trade, whether you're in the short run or the long run. But the gains increase as you can specialize in the production of the good that you have comparative advantage in. However, in the short run, when factors are, at least one factor is fixed, you will have both winners and losers. So in the short run, even though the entire nation is better off, there will be one group in the country, the ones working in the export industry, that's going to benefit from trade. But there will be another group in the country, the one working in the import competing industry, that will be worse off from trade. However, if we allow time to pass, so we move from the short run to the long run where all factors are variable, then all workers will also they will specialize in the export industry, and all workers will be better off. So in the long run, we have that the country is better off, and everybody within the country is better off as well. That is, trade is good for everyone. But I want you to just notice that this is only true in a very specific situation where we have a perfect world. So there's perfectly competitive markets. There are no market failures. All countries will be small. And workers, the factor here is, there's only a single identical factor, first of all. And that single identical factor can move wherever it wants to go. That is, wherever the real wage is higher. And in that specific world, trade is good for everyone. All right. Thank you very much.